Welcome to the Journey Home. I'm glad you've joined us tonight. I have what might be called a double hitter tonight on the Journey Home. This is to be one of a series of programs that we're dedicating to what we might call classic converts. Tonight we're going to focus on the conversion of a very famous, at one time, household word, English writer G.K. Chesterton and his conversion to the church. But the guest that I have tonight, who's an expert on Chesterton, whose name is Dale Ahlquist, himself is a convert, for whom Chesterton's journey had a major part to play in that. So you're going to get two conversion stories tonight. And so bear with us, get your questions ready about Chesterton or about other issues of conversion. Remember that your questions are an important part of our program. So call us at 1-800-221-9460 or send us an email at journeyhome@EWTN.com. Dale, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Marcus. It's wonderful to be here in Alabama.
Well, it's a little warmer than the 24 inches of snow you had up in Minneapolis, right?
Yeah.
You know, I was telling you earlier that it was an interesting mix in how this came together, because when I knew that I wanted to do a program on Chesterton, I went to your website. Didn't know it was yours. I went to the website for the American Chesterton Society, sent you an email. Do you know of anybody who would be willing to come on the program and talk about Chesterton? And then you told me your story. So then I signed you up and then found out I already had you in my file from an article that somebody sent me. So it came together, both of your journeys.
That was great.
So it's good to have. Why don't we have you on the program? Let's begin where I usually begin. Long before we get to Chesterton, let's have you share with the audience your early spiritual journey.
I was born in a Christian home. My parents were Baptist. My father was a missionary's son. He grew up in India. His father was a missionary doctor in the jungle.
Is that right?
Yeah, in the headhunting area of northeast India. My father grew up telling wonderful stories about growing up in the jungle. We were a very close-knit family, 6 children. My parents imbued in us a love for the scripture. We were regular attenders of church. We went 3 times a week to the Baptist church. And I always had a deep love for God. And when I grew up, I was memorizing scripture fervently. In my younger days, in fact still do this, I recite scripture. I've memorized whole books of the Bible. I've memorized the book of James and 7 chapters of the Gospel of John and the book of Ecclesiastes, and recited these in churches. And
is that right?
Yeah, I've done that.
Have you memorized Hesitations yet?
Hesitations, I'm memorizing that right now. As a matter. But I had
That's a great witness. You know, I hate to interrupt you, but I think to do that, because that's the way the original Christians heard them.
Amen.
Right?
Yeah.
Read out loud.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it does make the word come alive too when people hear it read out loud, which is what happens at Mass every Sunday.
That's right.
But the fact is, I had was always a really devoted Christian. But shortly after getting married in 1981, my wife and I we honeymooned in Rome. We were in Rome the day the Pope was shot.
Is that right?
Yeah, we were in Rome the day the Pope was shot, and I still had no intention of becoming a Catholic at that point. But I have to say, it was on my honeymoon when my journey to Rome began, because I started reading G.K. Chesterton on my honeymoon, and at the same time, throughout the following years of my marriage, reading more Chesterton, also starting to have sort of a dissatisfaction with any of the churches that I was attending, knowing that none of them were quite right, that there was something missing in every church that I had attended.
What was it? I mean, you started the Chesterton Society at this point?
I started the Chesterton Society a few years ago.
Okay.
And,
so it was later.
But I was involved with a group of Chestertonians before that, before starting the American Chesterton Society.
Well, let's go back a little bit to that part of your journey. And where was the Catholic Church at all? I mean, you're visiting Rome. How did you feel about it being brought up a Baptist?
The Catholic Church, I would say that we were not fervently anti-Catholic, but certainly there was a position that, well, whatever the Catholic Church taught, they obviously were wrong, and we'll begin from there. You know, we'll find out what the Catholic Church taught on it, and then we'll get to the truth after that. So we had not a strong anti-Catholic upbringing, but it was there that we just felt that the church was wrong.
Did you think of yourselves as Protestants? In other words, in relationship to the church, or was it just not something you thought about? You're just more focused on your own Baptist belief?
It's funny how I always called myself a Protestant. In fact, I try to sometimes avoid a denominational term, but I would make clear that it was Protestant.
Yeah. All right, well then you're on your honeymoon and you pick up a book of Chesterton. I hope your wife was glad that you were reading Chesterton on your honeymoon. Was that the journey that got you going to the church?
It was, without me knowing it. I fell in love with Chesterton instantly. I found there a writer unlike any other, a gift for the English language, someone who had the ring of truth in everything he wrote, and I just wanted to read anything I could get my hands on by G.K. Chesterton at that point. And I soon discovered he was Catholic, but I sort of ignored that. It was good enough for me that he was Christian. I knew that he had had a profound influence in C.S. Lewis's life, that he had written a book that C.S. Lewis had read while he was an atheist that changed his mind towards the Christian faith.
Which one was that?
That was The Everlasting Man.
Okay.
And C.S. Lewis said, a young man who's serious about his atheism should not read Chesterton. And so I started realizing what a profound influence this writer had on other people. But I was finding that he was right on everything he was hitting, that he was a consistent thinker, a complete thinker, that he addressed everything. He had all his bases covered. And at a certain point, I realized that I had to come to grips with his Catholic thinking as well.
Well, that certainly those kinds of thoughts from his perspective are going to run right up against so much of what you believed and were taught as a Baptist. Well, explain some of the things that opened your heart then to start listening to the Catholic Church.
So first of all, he talked about the historical church. I think so many Protestants somehow think that Christianity began sometime in the 1500s, and his defense of the historical church and of what happened in the early church and throughout the medieval times, how there was a more solid society in the medieval times when there was one faith. And I think, I have to say this too, I was always troubled by the division within Christianity. That always was something that bothered me very much, that there were too many churches, and I knew that there should be only one church. I just didn't think that it would be the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Or you saw it as the invisible church, which is the way we all explained
it. Yeah, right, exactly, the invisible church, right. Yeah. But I at that point, what Chesterton, one of the things he said about his own conversion was that it's all the things that you initially object to the church, object for your reasons for joining the church, those are eventually the reasons why you become a Catholic. And interestingly enough, something stuck that I had read about Chesterton, that there had been a cause introduced for his sainthood. And some of the Catholic Chestertonians were saying, well, this is bad because this is going to turn people off towards Chesterton. And I was sitting there thinking, someone who hadn't been, who thought that the cult of the saints was completely backwards, thinking, that makes sense. Chesterton's a saint. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. If he's not a saint for the 20th century, there isn't one. And suddenly the whole idea of sainthood made sense when it never had before, because I saw someone not only of heroic virtue, but someone gifted to express the Christian faith. And I understood what the cult of the saints meant. Finally, there's certainly a Chesterton cult of a group devoted to his thinking. That made sense to me. It never had before. But I even said to the Catholic friends of mine, I said, listen, if the church canonizes Chesterton, then I'll convert. But I didn't, at that point I really wasn't taking it seriously, except for the fact I was realizing I couldn't go back.
So was it his historical view that got more and more of your attention?
Certainly that was the initial thing, but his defense of the faith at every aspect of it, from the Eucharist to confession. Certainly confession was one of the main things he hit on. Any faith based on the sacrament of confession is one based on truth, because that's what confession is. It's telling the truth.
What's happened so often in the conversions of folk on the journey is that they'll listen And then pretty soon they start finding things that are very convincing and more and more and more and more and more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the jump.
Yes.
Usually there's something or some issue or some person that finally convinces you that this is what I've got to do. What was it in your own life?
For me, it was having an argument with a friend of mine about Chesterton. And interestingly enough, this person was only arguing about Chesterton's economic ideas. And he was saying to me, Dale, you don't really understand Chesterton. And of course, I had read far more Chesterton than he had. And I should have been insulted by what he said. But instead, something hit me saying, you know, I really haven't embraced all of Chesterton yet. And I haven't embraced him until I followed him all the way to Rome.
Yeah.
And it was driving home from that conversation when I made the decision that I've got to go all the way to Rome. I've got to join the Catholic Church.
How long ago was that?
Well, that was just over 2 years ago.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're still a fresh Catholic.
Yeah, I'm fresh.
What about the rest of your family? Did they come in with you?
My wife was raised as a Catholic, but had really left the church. As a result of my pilgrimage, she came back to the church with me. When I was received into the church, my 2 oldest children had their first communion the same time I did, and that was on Holy Family Sunday of 1997.
All right. Well, I know there's a lot of issues that you had to consider, like so many of us, and maybe the audience would like to pose those to you later. Let's move on to the second hitter of our inning.
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton, a man who at one time was a household name
Yes.
in at least Catholic families, but probably almost anyone who read intellectually, right? But today a lot of people don't even know of him. Let's talk about his conversion, who he was, and what brought him to the Catholic faith.
Well, first of all, a little bit about G.K. Chesterton. The best way to describe him is that he was a giant. He was a big man. He was tall and large. He was 300 pounds. He cut an interesting figure when he walked down the road because he always wore a big cape and carried a sword stick and wore a big floppy hat and had a huge mustache and little glasses at the end of his nose, and he was almost always smoking a cigar. He said, some men write with a pen, some write with a pencil, I write with a cigar. But he did a lot of writing because he was really probably one of the most prolific writers of all time, certainly of the 20th century.
Had he started out to be a writer?
He started out to be an art student. He was going to be an artist, and when he was a young man, he was asked to contribute a few art reviews for a magazine, and he went on to write for the rest of his life. Then that was in 1900, and he wrote till 1936, till the day he died, and he wrote 100 books, contributions to 200 more, over 4,000 essays for the London newspapers. 4,000 essays, Marcus. That's, if you try to give you an idea, sit down and write an essay a day for the next 11 years. And you'll get an idea of how many essays he wrote. But then he wrote poems and some plays and novels and a whole series of detective stories featuring a priest as his detective, Father Brown, the Father Brown mysteries.
Which the audience is probably a little more familiar with than
it's
some of the
probably
other
the
things.
thing he was most famous for were his Father Brown mysteries, because they were the best-selling of his books. And he started writing these Father Brown stories actually before he became Catholic. It was based on a priest he knew. The character was based on a priest he knew. And so
did he write those straddling his conversion?
Yeah, straddling his conversion, right. The first.
Did Father Brown change in the midst of the stories?
You know what's the most amazing thing is Chesterton's writing as a whole did not change from before his conversion to after it. He wrote so consistently and from a consistent point of view that it's almost impossible to date his writing if you don't know the date it was written.
Of his conversion.
It's like in the myth of Athena that was born full grown from the head of Zeus. Chesterton emerged as a full grown writer when he started writing, and Etienne Gilson, the French Thomist theologian, said that Chesterton didn't reason towards the truth; he reasoned from the truth. And so he was defending the Catholic faith, long before his conversion.
Where did he begin spiritually in his journey?
He came from a Universalist background. His parents were Unitarian Universalist, but at the time of his marriage, he was Anglican, and so his religious conversion to Christianity took place shortly before that, before 1900. He didn't join the church though till 1922, when he was 48 years old.
Why so long?
Well, that's a good question, and there's a couple of answers to it. Certainly one is that his wife had not converted, and he didn't do anything without his wife. That is always, it just shows how close he was and devoted to his wife, and how important it was that she share in his faith. She did eventually convert 2 years after he did. But there's one other element that comes out in his writing that I think a lot of people miss. And he said that it's not what people who are the enemies of the Catholic faith say about the faith that scares off a convert. It's sometimes what the insiders will say. He said there's 100 foolish comments by opponents will do nothing to a convert, but one foolish comment by a Catholic can do untold damage.
Interesting.
We really have to be careful how we present the faith. And
model it. And
we have to, and what do we emphasize to outsiders? We have to always be really careful what we emphasize, so that it's the love and the truth together always, and not some distraction or some small detail that really is an insider's matter, something that...
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Because sometimes outsiders will see us arguing or being upset about things we see happening in the church, and to an outsider, they don't get it, they don't understand, and so they see arguing, fighting people.
Right.
Where's the charity?
Right.
And it doesn't mean that between closed doors we're not talking about renewal, things that need to be happening, but we need to be recognizing every word, every action is a word of the gospel.
Yeah. In fact, Chesterton, one of the things that charmed him about the Catholic Church was that there were these fundamental doctrines that Catholics are to agree on, and then that they are free to argue about other things. In fact, he enjoyed the arguing, he enjoyed the debating. But as far as how we present the faith to an outsider, that's where it's very very important. And so there was obviously something that was scaring him off for a while. And I think he even said at the last, it was fear. His reason was there. He accepted it in his mind. He said, although I'm no longer a Protestant, I'm not yet a Catholic. And he was in that stuck period, but he I think at the end it was fear of knowing that once you do this, you don't go back. It's that he said it's like stepping over the edge. You can't cross back anymore.
But what brought him over the abyss?
Well, I guess the Holy Spirit.
When did he convert? What year?
It was 1922.
22. Okay.
Yeah. And there were several incidents in his life where I think certain people who knew about his closeness to the faith and his defense of the faith expected him to convert before that. One was the death of his brother, who also was a Catholic convert. One was Chesterton had went into a coma at one point. He's like just had a complete physical breakdown. Was in a coma for 3 months, and when he emerged from that, people expected him to embrace the faith. That was in 1915, and he still didn't do it till 1922. And you can't point to one incident except for the fact it was time. Now, he did say, when he read the catechism that Father O'Connor, who was the model for Father Brown, gave him a catechism to read, and he said there was something in there that he read that crystallized everything for him, and that was that the two sins against hope are presumption and despair. And he said everything in his life that he tried to write about when he was battling the forces of modern thought, he said that the two sins that he was fighting against were presumption and despair.
Despair, interesting. Now he was close friends, acquaintances with some fairly well-known characters that many of the audience may recognize.
Yeah, certainly George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells. He also debated Bertrand Russell and Clarence Darrow. He debated all these people publicly. He knew George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells personally. He was good friends with them.
People who many of the audience remember and read their books, but may not remember what some of their values and some of their platforms were that Chesterton, in fact, along with his good friend Belloc, would fight against.
Yeah, we are living the legacy of these other thinkers, of Shaw and Wells, which is relativism and determinism and fatalism and pessimism, and some of their socialist and liberalism. We don't ever hear the other side of the argument, and Chesterton offered the other side of the argument at the time. In fact, in the public debates, the consensus was that he out-debated them if you read the contemporary accounts, that he emerged the winner, and yet we never listen to the other side of the argument anymore. We never hear Chesterton's defense of the faith against these relativistic tendencies.
It really is sad too, because I know that it was only the last couple of years that I discovered how much H.G. Wells was a negative influence on our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So much behind what we see in modern feminism, and so much of that could be traced back to H.G. Wells and his writings and his influence. But Chesterton becomes a forgotten man.
Yeah. And
I mean, that's amazing.
It is amazing, and it shows really the downfall of our education system. It shows the downfall of so much of the media too, of not bringing Chesterton's ideas into the public arena again. And I think it's simply because they don't want to engage him, because they would have to answer his excellent points that he makes.
Now, I cannot have a program about Hilaire Belloc because he was not a convert.
That's right, you can't.
But he's one of my favorite guys. Can you say something about one of Chesterton's best friends? Is that right?
Yeah, they were good friends from the period of when Chesterton started writing. Is almost right at the time he met Belloc, and they definitely supported each other in their arguments against the attacks on the faith. Belloc is a very clear and beautiful writer, both his poetry and his prose. Funny man. He's got that kind of hard edge to him.
Yeah.
Chesterton's sort of the soft touch. And
They were good together.
Yeah, they were good. They're the perfect balance for each other. Yeah.
But I know that in Belloc's own life, I mean, he was a prolific writer also, the
Yes.
185 books
Yes.
and on. But his books, as he got older, took on a more direct apologetic of the church.
Yes.
And it seems to me that it happened about the time Chesterton himself converted. Wasn't it approximately in that same time period?
Yeah, I would say that his apologetics for the church were from that time period. I think what's ironic is that Belloc was surprised when Chesterton did convert. He almost didn't expect it. It was almost blindsided him.
Now, these guys wrote 100 years ago. All right, why should our modern audience, when they've got so many books today, so many great books, why should we dig back 100 years to the writings of Chesterton and Belloc?
Well, they started writing 99 years ago, okay, Marcus, so it's not 100, first of all. They're 20th century writers, and they were writing on the front end of what we're on the back end of, and they saw everything coming that has in fact come. They warned against it. Chesterton's prophecies, if you will, are so amazing. He could see what was happening with World War II. He saw it was coming before it happened. He saw the rise and the fall of communism. He said it would die out in a couple generations. He said that in 1918. He predicted so many things that happened. That's one reason it shows that he was right. But also, if you read Chesterton now, you'd swear he was writing for today. It seems like he's more timely today than even the time.
Given the context in which we live at the end of this millennium.
Yes.
For example,
what he saw of our relativism, for instance, moral relativism. He said, our enemy is not Moscow, it's Manhattan. Mm-hmm. He said, the next great attack will be on sexual morals, he said.
Well, that's interesting. There's prophetic there. And he also had a strong view with Belloc on agrarianism, is that right? Given even the over-dependence that we've become in this culture.
Yeah, the name of their economic theory that they supported was distributism, which means the wide distribution of property. If more people owned their own means of production, they'd have greater autonomy and greater personal freedom. We always, as Americans, defend capitalism, but then we don't quite think of what capitalism is, which is a monopoly game. It ends with one person owning everything. And that's not the most equal way and fair way for a society to operate. And the idea is that if everyone's a wage slave, well, they're a slave and they're not free. But if they're working for themselves and creating their own means of production, and is self-sufficient as much as possible, and that if government is as local as possible, there is more freedom and more autonomy and more equality in a society.
And that idea, which it sounds more and more appealing today as we look at how overly dependent we become on technology, and therefore how vulnerable we become as families and as a culture.
Yeah.
But at his time, were those ideas accepted very well?
No, they weren't accepted very well at all. But people loved to hear Chesterton support the ideas. They loved to hear Chesterton defend it, and there was a small distributist movement. Another one of his great points was he said wage slavery, like any other slavery, will break up a family. Slavery breaks up families, and isn't that what we've seen in our society too? Is the breakup of families?
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
If our audience wanted to begin somewhere with Chesterton, where would you begin? Where would you recommend they begin?
Well, there are 4 or 5 answers to that question. One is any Chesterton you can get your hands on. That's always one
Some
place to begin.
might be a little more rough.
Yeah, but there are certain books that are essential to read. One is certainly Orthodoxy, which is an incredible piece of rhetoric besides being a great description and a fresh description of the Christian faith. Yeah, an easy one to read, and this is both Orthodox, and this one is available from Ignatius. What's Wrong with the World? You'll swear that's written today rather than in 1910 when it was written. There's also the Father Brown stories, a good place to begin if you like detective fiction. That's a good place. But the best, if you're brand new, the best way is to read this magazine.
Well, tell about it. Yeah.
Gilbert. This is put out by the Chesterton Institute, and we...
what kind of articles are in there?
We always have 1 or 2 essays by Chesterton, but then several essays by contemporary writers who are taking a Chesterton idea and applying it to right now. Also a bunch of short quotations of Chesterton, because he was really one of the most quotable writers in the English language, and so we have a rich collection of quotations in each magazine. But boy, this is a great place to start for Chesterton right there.
Thanks a lot, Dale. We'll take a break now, and I want to encourage our listeners to pose some questions for us, either about Chesterton or about themes of Chesterton's journey, or maybe things from Dale's own journey. Again, the phone number is 1-800-221-9460, and an email address is journeyhome@EWTN.com. And I think during the break there'll be some information if you want more information about the Chesterton Society. So we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Journey Home. My guest this evening is Dale Ahlquist, the founder and president, right, of the American Chesterton Institute Society.
American Chesterton Society.
Make sure I get it right.
Wait, that's okay. Yeah, there is a Chesterton Institute, which we work closely with them, and that's another organization.
All right.
Yeah.
And our topic tonight is both your conversion, Dale, to the church, and the conversion of G.K. Chesterton. So we invite your questions on phone or email. In fact, we have a phone caller waiting right away. This is Jim from Canada. Welcome, Jim. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Mark. So, love your show.
Great.
For starters, I was introduced to Chesterton. I was given a book called Brave New Family, a series of essays, and
that's another good introduction to.
Oh, I fell in love with him. What a delightful mind. His mind was like a playground. The way he thought did so much for me. I just kept reading and reading, and my question is this. Chesterton eventually converted, and his contemporary C.S. Lewis didn't. And much of what I've read by Lewis seems to be so Catholic as well. I've read some things that he's written on purgatory, and it touched me as being just so beautiful. I'm wondering if your guest could shed some light on C.S. Lewis and the end of his life, and exactly what happened, and maybe why he didn't convert, or what's the story there.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, a lot of people think that Chesterton and Lewis were contemporaries and they knew each other. They actually were not contemporaries, though their lives overlap. But Lewis really comes a generation after Chesterton. Lewis read Chesterton, but Chesterton really never knew about Lewis or read any C.S. Lewis. And as I mentioned earlier, C.S. Lewis read The Everlasting Man, which had a profound effect on his own conversion to Christianity, going from an atheist to becoming a Christian. I think C.S. Lewis, the reason, that this is a really interesting topic. Why didn't C.S. Lewis become a Christian? I mean, a Catholic. And the simple answer is he chose not to. He decided not to. Talking with some people who knew C.S. Lewis, that when they talked with him about specifically the Catholic Church, his eyes would sort of glaze over. He wanted to think that there was this invisible church, that there was just one Christian church, and the Catholic Church was one of them. Some of his objections to conversion to the Catholic faith were the classic ones. He was not troubled by the Virgin Mary, and he didn't think it was scriptural enough, which obviously he had not investigated the Catholic Church itself closely enough. I have to say one other thing, though. C.S. Lewis is a writer that appeals to many Catholics and Protestants. G.K. Chesterton is a writer that appeals to many Catholics and Protestants. What we need more than anything, of course, is the reunion of the Christian Church. And Father Boyd, who's the editor of the Chesterton Review, said that Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, just as Luther was a morning star of the Reformation, Chesterton and Lewis could be the morning stars of the reunion. He's gotten Catholics and Protestants talking to each other and realizing that they are very close. And the fact that C.S. Lewis didn't convert, but Catholics still like him, is maybe a good sign towards the reunion.
It's interesting, the idea of seeing them as maybe a bridge. And I know back when we were in Steubenville, we had a Belloc Society we would gather, and I'm wondering, would you suggest that maybe that's a way to have a bridge? People could gather once a month to maybe discuss a letter or an article written by Chesterton.
In the Twin Cities, where I'm from, we have a monthly gathering of the Twin Cities Chestertonians. It's a good opportunity to smoke cigars. But we do talk about different aspects of Chesterton's writings throughout, and we have a very diverse group of people, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, that meet together.
So a good place to begin.
Yeah.
Maybe later, if we have time, we can have you to talk a little bit about that book, The Everlasting Man,
Sure.
and what it was all about, and why it had such an impact. Let's go to our first email, though. Dear brothers, so many of my Protestant friends bring up the scripture, quote, "True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth," to underscore their belief in the invisible church. What did G.K. Chesterton say about the visible Church of Rome to counter this idea? Love the show. Dan Franchi, Rochester, Illinois.
Well, he certainly talked about the visible church being the Catholic Church. As far as countering this particular idea, he would certainly bring out the fact that each Protestant sect, what they've done is they've focused in on one Catholic truth to the exclusion of all other Catholic truths. In fact, he said every sect is what they've done is they've taken one Catholic truth and run with it, and they use that mystical truth to somehow disprove all other mystical truths about the Catholic Church, not realizing that the one mystical truth that they've grasped is just as mystical as the others. The fact that so that what they've done, with that particular aspect, the spirit and truth. Well, they're leaving out the larger picture. That's how Chesterton would argue. They're leaving out so much more. He said every Protestant sect, every heresy is choosing a particular truth.
And that's really the danger of what we might call proof texting, because you could take that particular verse out and use it to say a lot of different things.
Right.
I mean, the New Age movement is what they consider spirit and what they consider truth. So, I mean, that's the danger of something out of the context. And I mean, I'm sure he was a thinker that looked at the big
picture. He was such a complete thinker, yes.
Let's take our next phone caller. This is Michael from Florida. Hello, Michael. What's your question for us tonight?
My question is, because I admired and still admire Bishop Fulton Sheen's writings, was if your guest here this evening knew that Sheen said that Chesterton was an author that he could not do without, that he had to be part of Bishop Sheen's life. I wondered if you knew if there was a friendship or relationship between them.
Thank you.
There was, in fact, a friendship between Bishop Fulton Sheen and Chesterton. Chesterton wrote an introduction for one of Bishop Sheen's books. It probably was the first book he published.
That's one on philosophy?
It's called God and Intelligence.
Yes.
Chesterton wrote the introduction to that. Sheen was studying in England, probably had some other opportunities to meet with Chesterton. He said that the most influential person on his life, the first most influential person on his own writing was G.K. Chesterton. And he also attended Chesterton's funeral.
You take our next email. Thank you, Dale. This comes from Sylvia. Hello, Dale and Marcus. We have so many wonderful translations of Catholic writings from foreign languages, and often a translation also serves as an interpretation of the writing too. Some of Chesterton's writings, though in English, are not that easy for the common reader to interpret. Are there books available that discuss, explain, interpret his writings and ideas for the common reader, i.e. for John Q. Catholic? Thanks, Sylvia.
Well, it's ironic. Chesterton is, one of his great things is what a clear writer he is. But you have to be prepared to eat a steak and not eat yogurt when you're reading Chesterton. And that's one of the reasons why we publish this magazine, Gilbert. It's a way to access his writings in small chunks. And it's true that today's reader has to take things in small doses. And I would recommend our magazine first. There are books about Chesterton and about his life, which would also make good introductions to his writing. But that's one of the reasons the magazine is here, is to bring Chesterton to a new generation that can't maybe handle a big book at one time.
Well, he was an amazing writer too.
Yes.
And I wonder, I don't know if, he wrote his books before the laptop computer.
Yeah.
He also wrote them before Sunday NFL football and television and even radio,
Yeah.
right? Or was radio out? It was
Actually, towards the end of his life, he spoke on the radio in the 1930s.
sort of
Yeah,
coming out.
yeah.
But talk a bit about how he wrote, because that's pretty amazing.
Well, it seems like he wrote all the time. Because anyone who was that prolific was always writing. But there are a few stories that are just absolutely amazing. The fact that he could actually write 2 essays at once. Literally, he would write one essay out longhand while dictating another essay to his secretary at the same time. So how's that for a great mind?
That's amazing.
Yeah, and when he did a lot of his writing in railway stations too, because he missed the train that he was supposed to be on because he was so focused on the next thought. And he was a man who just always was deep in thought, trying to get the next idea out. But when you see his writing, you're actually seeing his thinking process, because there were no rough drafts for anything he wrote. He wrote it out, and that's what got published.
Thank you, thank you. Let's take our next caller. This is Rita from Pennsylvania. Hello, Rita. What's your
Hi.
question for us tonight?
Okay, you mentioned that Chesterton was an Anglican, and your guest also was a practicing Anglican. I'm familiar with this tradition, and after speaking with several Anglican priests, they really truly believe that they are receiving the true body and blood of Jesus Christ. As an Anglican, did your guest feel he was receiving the true presence? And the way I understand it, that the Roman Catholics do not believe this is a valid communion. And I'm assuming it is because of the Pope who makes the determination whether this is a valid communion. But if your guest really did feel that he was receiving the true presence, would just the mere fact that someone said he wasn't change his experience?
Thank you very much. Well, actually, you weren't an Anglican.
Right, I
You were
was not an Anglican. I was Baptist, so I'm sorry for giving the impression that I was Anglican. But I can address the question a little bit, I think, because Chesterton did consider himself Anglo-Catholic for a while. That was part of the Catholic Church, but he was never strong on that. He never really tried to make the connection in a strong way. But he was invited to speak at certain Anglo-Catholic conferences, for instance, before his conversion. He did say in one of his books, I believe it's the book "The Thing: Why I Am a Catholic," that what happened with the Anglican Church with Henry VIII was that Henry VIII was Catholic in every respect, in every respect, until he broke with Rome, until he stopped recognizing the authority of the Pope. As soon as he did that, even though all the trappings were still Catholic, the faith of that church, of the Anglican Church, began to change, and it hasn't stopped changing since that moment. And if you look at where the two churches have gone since that date, you think of how far the Anglican Church has changed from the Roman Catholic faith. I mean, that really shows.
And I remember, the second guest that we had on the journey home was Father Graham Leonard, the former Anglican Bishop of London. The issue that brought him in to the church was he realized that the authority was lost in the Anglican Church. Mm-hmm. Who could determine at any one time what was true in the Anglican Church? Because they didn't have the living authority left to decide between the arguments that were happening in the church. And so you have this malaise, this movement, this kind of entropy, always moving away from the way the church used to be. I mean, it's one thing, anyone can say this is the real presence.
Yeah.
In fact, that phrase, real presence, is used by many non-Catholic denominations. Mm-hmm. What they mean by the real presence is a whole lot different than what the Catholic Church has always taught.
But again, it's the whole picture, and you know, it's different. It's something. It became something less and less and less in the Anglican Church.
That's right. Let's take this next email, if we would. This comes from Carol in Minneapolis. Oh, your hometown.
Ooh,
that's right.
I wonder if there's anyone I know.
Yeah. Thank you for the interesting program. It sounds like Chesterton echoes many of Leo XIII's themes from Rerum Novarum on the condition of labor. What does Chesterton say about just wages?
Well, Chesterton based his economic ideas on Rerum Novarum.
Okay.
Yeah, he and
maybe tell the audience a little bit more about Rerum Novarum.
It was an encyclical letter of Pope Leo's in 1891, Leo XIII, and the idea of just and equal distribution of property. That phrase is in there, and that's why the term distributism came from a phrase of Pope Leo XIII. He also defended trade unions and a just wage, that workers should be paid a just wage.
Did he use that encyclical as a foundation for his ideas before he was a Catholic also?
Well, you'd have to say yes, because he was clearly a distributist before his conversion. Yeah. But of course, so was Belloc. So they were thinking together on that. But Chesterton would. He defended just wage, except he was against wages. He was against the idea of wage earning because he saw that as a form of slavery, so he had a big argument against that whole economic system of wage earning. But he certainly would argue for a just wage in a fallen economic system. That certainly the poor people have to be provided for. His whole argument against capitalism, he said, is not that there are too many capitalists, but there are too few. There's only the people who are the owners who get to pay those wages, and there are too few
number that have the most,
right,
and the rest that have the scraps.
Right.
I mean, that's really what we look at our culture and we see it all over the world.
Yeah.
Let's take our next caller, if you would. This is Roy from Massachusetts. Hello, Roy. What's your question for us?
Hello, and hello, Dale.
Roy Moore.
Yes.
I don't know this guy.
Yeah, you do.
Okay.
Yeah, how you doing?
Are you going to make something hard for him here tonight?
Okay. Dale, in our culture nowadays, with all the horrendous things going on in television, movies, and such, people happen to be split in two mindsets culturally. One going to one extreme strictness, Puritanism, which America's culture is basically in that, and the other extreme laxity, the hedonism that we've seen especially since the 1960s. What was Chesterton's views briefly on both Puritanism and hedonism? Because he took the attitude of a plague on both your houses against both of these philosophies.
Very good. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you.
Roy just answered the question right before he got off there. He did say a plague on both your houses. He was equally...
He stole your quote.
Yeah, that's okay. He was equally against Puritanism and paganism. Puritanism he defined as indignation about the wrong things, that it was something smaller that was usually typed... Well, for instance, they were arguing in favor of prohibition during Chesterton's lifetime, which he couldn't understand why something that was so basic to a society and to the enjoyment of the poor and the working class, their glass of beer, how anyone would take that away from him. He said prohibition only benefited the rich; it didn't benefit the poor man. And but then on the other hand, he argued against paganism, the modern paganism, which was as Roy said, hedonism, the pure pleasure delights. And the idea that the Catholic view is that what God created is good, and we are to enjoy it. But temperance means temperance. It means self-control. We're supposed to have self-control, but that doesn't mean to not enjoy the good things that God gave us. And he had a wonderful way of presenting this throughout his writings about, enjoying what God gave us from a glass of beer. But he says we can thank God for beer and Burgundy by not drinking too much of them.
You'd mentioned a book earlier that was a big influence on C.S. Lewis.
The Everlasting Man.
Talk about that book for a second.
The Everlasting Man was...
Quickly, because we've got all kinds of calls, but I think we've got to hit that book.
Well, I'll tell you, it was written sort of as a response to H.G. Wells' The Outline of History. It is the history of the world in two parts.
And sadly, so many people have the outlines of history on their shelves.
And they don't read The Everlasting Man.
Yes.
And the argument he makes is he splits the book up into two parts, which is the same way we split up history before Christ and A.D., B.C. and A.D., and how the unique creature man and then the unique man Christ, and how history changed when Christ stepped onto the stage. And it's just a wonderful, brief and intense exposition of history.
A philosophical book?
Yeah, it's everything. Chesterton's books hit everything.
Okay. Let's take this next email, if you would. This comes from Tom Salmon in University Heights, Ohio. Gentlemen, now that Graham Greene and Walker Percy are deceased and J.F. Powers has apparently stopped writing, who are the Catholic novelists today who write from the Catholic perspective? Outside of novelists, who are the leading Catholic thinkers today who have written works accessible to the lay reader?
Well, first, Michael O'Brien comes to mind.
I happen to notice that in the back of your magazine, it promotes some of Michael's books.
Yeah, and that would be the first name that comes to mind as a Catholic novelist. But also Ralph McInerney. I think his novels and his writings are important and good and accessible. Those are the two names that come to mind. But read Chesterton. Yeah. Well, we can let future generations read the writers who are writing now, but we should read Chesterton.
And it's a reminder, even this person's article is that just because a certain author's books are out of print doesn't mean that therefore we wipe them off the slate of influence.
Right.
I mean, there's so many great writers that we should keep bringing back.
Amen.
And introducing our children to.
Amen. Right.
Let's take our next caller. This is Sal, Massachusetts, from Massachusetts. Hello, Sal. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi. I really enjoy your show. I just wanted to, if you could make a comment on the relationship between H.G. Wells and Chesterton.
Yeah.
I heard it was there was quite a rivalry there.
Yeah, let's talk. Thank you. Let's talk more about that because we did mention him earlier, but that's very important.
Yeah, they debated each other. They were philosophical opponents on virtually every topic, but they were friends. They were close friends, and the charming thing about Chesterton is that he really didn't have an enemy in the world. His philosophical opponents held him in great esteem, both for his clear thinking and for him as a person. They loved the man. They loved him. And after Chesterton died, H.G. Wells talked to Mrs. Chesterton and said, "If there's any chance of me going to heaven, it's because of G.K. Chesterton."
Now, on the other hand, Belloc had a little different approach.
Yeah, Belloc, there's speaking the truth in love, and then there's speaking the truth, and Belloc certainly hit the truth hard, and he was a polemicist. But there's also a tender side to Belloc that sometimes we overlook.
You joke about the rough side.
Right.
I think one thing that I was so pleased when I read about Belloc is that when H.G. Wells was releasing chapter after chapter of his outlines,
Belloc was writing
was putting them out there, answering and answering.
He answered all of Wells' arguments as they were coming out. And where's Belloc's writings today? Why isn't it published alongside of H.G. Wells?
Would you say, in a sense, that therefore Chesterton and Belloc and others like them are what you might call white martyrs?
Yeah, you could certainly make that argument. Any new anthology of English literature that comes out doesn't have Chesterton in it, but it's also because they don't want to engage him. They just don't want to engage him.
Yeah, there's an example of people who, when they let their Catholic commitments become more and more public, then the publishers, the ones who did the critics, made them more and more out of view of the public until, almost
Yeah.
destroyed Belloc's career.
Yeah, there's no question that Chesterton's public persona and his reputation as a writer took a dive after his conversion.
Okay.
There's no question.
And they're model for us
Yep.
to take a stand out there, even if it means
Yep.
losing a bit of popularity.
That's right.
Let's take our next emailer. This is from Teresa in Seattle. Dear Marcus and Dale, praise be to Jesus Christ. I read somewhere that Chesterton would close his letters to G.B. Shaw with "Long live the Pope." Is this true? Can you tell the story behind this?
He wrote several letters to. He wasn't a great letter writer, but I do know he wrote some letters to Shaw. They had some exchanges of letters, and he certainly added that line, "Long live the Pope." And when before his conversion, Shaw would refer to him as this hobby of yours, this Roman Catholic hobby of yours. But then when he actually did convert, he sent a telegram. Shaw sent him a telegram saying, "No, Gilbert, this is going too far."
Let's. I'm going to ask you some specific questions about maybe his beliefs. He moved from a Unitarian background through Anglicanism to the High Church Anglicanism to the Catholic Church. What about the creed? There's a movement in different perspectives on the creed itself in that journey.
In The Everlasting Man, he makes a wonderful comment about the creed. He says the creed is like a key. And the first thing about a key is that it has a shape. It has a definite shape. And if you change the shape of a key, it doesn't work anymore. If you argue about the shape of a key and try to reconstruct it into something else, the key doesn't work anymore. If you say that the key is the same as all other keys, it's a distinct shape. If it becomes the same shape as all other keys, it doesn't work anymore. If you say the key is too complicated, well, he says the world is complicated. The world's a mess. And we've gotten ourselves into a complicated mess. We need a complicated key. The key is complicated because if we offer just platitudes and simplistic answers about peace and love, they're not going to solve the problems that are facing the world. He said there's only one simple thing about the key, which is the creed. It opens the door.
That's a powerful statement on the validity of the creed. Given your study of Chesterton, your commitment to Chesterton, and then your own conversion to the Catholic Church, how have these all brought you closer to Jesus Christ?
Well, just like Chesterton said, when you become Catholic, you don't leave off thinking, you begin to think. He says everything about the Catholic faith is the wonderful mysteries are just a beginning to something greater. He said, I haven't even begun to explore what the Holy Trinity can mean in its fullness, what the Eucharist means in all its fullness. It's just when you enter that door, you enter into a whole new huge world. He says the inside of the church is much larger than the outside. And he said, I can't even begin to explain how I'm exploring something that is new and new. And my own relationship with Jesus Christ has become much fuller as a result of following Chesterton to Rome. And I am, wondering how much greater it can get, but every day it's better. Every day it's more wonderful.
Dale, it's been a great pleasure to have you. Maybe one last word about the American Chesterton Society you might like to say to the audience.
We are trying to get Chesterton back into the public eye. We're trying to get his works back into the school, into the media. Visit us on our website, www.chesterton.org, and please subscribe to the magazine. It's good for college students, things like that. It's excellent.
Discussion groups
and
such. And the 800 number, again, is 1-800-343-2425. That's for the American Chesterton Society if you'd like to learn more about Chesterton.
Yeah, that's for the magazine. Yeah.
Dale, thank you very much.
Marcus.
What a great privilege, and thank you for sharing your own journey. It's always a challenge to those that I think that watch the program. Encourages those who are lifelong Catholics and those that are exploring. I think what you've done is you've also directed them to a very important source that helps people on the journey, and that is the great books. The great books of the church.
Amen.
And here is an author that has influenced so many people because of his convictions, Also because of, you mentioned, his charity and his gentility. You know, the only way that we can get those that believe differently than we do to hear us is if we earn the right to be heard. And that's what Chesterton did.
Amen.
He built the bridges.
Amen.
So he's a model for us. In this day when we're surrounded by so many conflicting ideas, voices that want to pull us, as the one caller said, either towards hedonism or toward a very strict Puritanism, that we see Chesterton as a balanced voice for that. So I thank you, audience, for joining us again. Look forward to being with you next week on the journey home. Let's keep each other in prayer because we walk this journey together. God bless.